The airport buzzed with energy as travelers rushed past one another. Families reunited, and flight announcements crackled overhead. Major Amara Johnson felt both the weight of exhaustion and the lightness of anticipation in her chest. After months of deployment in a foreign land, she was finally on her way home. Her dress uniform was crisp, adorned with medals earned through years of service, a testament to her dedication and resilience. As she navigated through the crowded terminal, Amara caught glimpses of people's eyes lingering on her uniform, some offering respectful nods, others casting quick, curious glances. She barely noticed. Her mind was already halfway home, her thoughts centered on her family's faces. She could practically feel her young nephew's arms around her, hear her mother's proud voice welcoming her back, and smell the homemade peach cobbler that would undoubtedly be waiting on the kitchen table. The day's good fortune had started earlier when, after years of loyal service to both her country and this airline, Amara had been bumped up to first class. It was a small comfort but one she savored, a rare chance to unwind after the intensity of deployment. First class meant room to breathe, to close her eyes, maybe even sleep without the constant hum of duty in the back of her mind. Just one more flight, and she'd be back in her family's embrace. Approaching the gate, she stood straighter, her boots clicking on the polished floor with each measured step. Her shoulders relaxed a bit. She let herself feel the rare privilege of being seen not only as a soldier but as a woman on her way home, eager for a sliver of peace after months of chaos. Boarding soon began, and she took her place in line, glancing around and exchanging small smiles with strangers. Just another traveler on a journey, or so she thought. As she reached her seat 3B, right at the front, she exhaled a long, deep breath, savoring the quiet moment. But just as she was about to settle in, a voice as sharp as a blade sliced through the familiar hum of boarding noise. "Excuse me, miss," the voice said, laced with a stern authority. "I think you're in the wrong section." Amara turned, her gaze landing on the captain, a man whose face seemed chiseled in stone, his eyes hardened and unwavering. In that instant, a ripple of tension swept through her, but she kept her expression neutral, calm. Years of training had taught her to face challenges head-on, and this would be no different, at least, that's what she told herself. "I'm sorry," she replied, her voice controlled but questioning, not yet understanding the implication behind his words. The captain's gaze swept over her, his eyes narrowing as if evaluating a trespasser. "You must be looking for economy. First class is up here." The tone in his voice was unmistakable, each word delivered with a dismissive edge that sliced through her calm. A bitter taste rose in Amara's throat. She felt the burn of his presumption, his assessment of her as someone who didn't belong, and the old ache of prejudice pricked her heart, raw and undeniable. Still, she held her ground, her fingers tightening around her boarding pass. This was her seat, her ticket, her right. But as she looked into his unwavering eyes, she knew that this was only the beginning. Amara's heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing louder as she faced the captain. His expression a blend of skepticism and something darker, a dismissive arrogance that made her skin prickle. She squared her shoulders, keeping her voice steady. "I'm in seat 3B, she said, holding up her boarding pass. The captain barely glanced at it before looking her up and down, as though she were an intruder rather than a paying passenger. "No, you're not," he replied curtly. "This section is reserved for those who belong here." The words landed like a slap, striking something deep inside her. She could feel the eyes of other passengers around them, curious, uncertain. Some exchanged glances, sensing the tension, but no one spoke up. Amara felt the familiar sting of discrimination, a bitter memory she'd pushed down many times before, rising now in full force. She had served her country for over a decade, had faced danger and chaos, had worn her uniform with pride. Yet here, in a place that should have felt like home, she was being questioned and doubted again. A tight, simmering anger bloomed in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "Captain, I'm Major Amara Johnson, United States Army, and this is my seat." The captain's mouth twitched, but there was no flicker of respect in his gaze, only a hardened defiance. "I don't care what your rank is. You need to go to the back of the plane." For a moment, silence hung thick in the air. Amara could hear her own heartbeat, each thump a reminder to stay composed. Every part of her wanted to shout, to demand he treat her with the respect she'd earned. But she knew better. Her voice remained even, firm. "I'm not moving." Her words fell like a challenge. The captain's face reddened, his mouth twisting in frustration, clearly unaccustomed to being defied, especially by someone he clearly believed was beneath him. He opened his mouth to respond, but a voice from behind interrupted him. "This is wrong," came a man's voice, cutting through the tense silence. A passenger in the row behind Amara had risen, his face etched with quiet indignation. "She's a soldier. She deserves respect." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind expression, nodded. "Let her sit in her seat. She's earned it." Amara felt a wave of relief, an unexpected surge of solidarity from strangers who saw the injustice unfolding before them. But the captain's face only hardened further, his eyes narrowing into slits. Embarrassment and anger warred in his expression, and she knew he wouldn't back down easily. "Sit down, or I'll have her removed from this flight," he snapped, his voice sharp with barely restrained rage. He turned back to Amara, his tone dripping with disdain. "You can either move to the back or I'll call security." She could feel the tension in the air, the collective breath of the passengers held in anticipation of her response. Every eye was on her, waiting to see if she would yield. But Amara had faced enemies far more dangerous than this man. She had fought, bled, and sacrificed for a country that too often forgot her value. She wasn't about to back down now. Straightening her spine, she looked the captain squarely in the eyes. "Go ahead," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "Call them. Let's see how well that works out for you." A ripple went through the cabin, an unspoken approval, a murmur of courage in the face of blatant injustice. Amara knew this was no ordinary confrontation. This was a battle for respect, a stand for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she wasn't moving, not now, not ever. The captain's face twisted, a mix of anger and disbelief as he stood before her, his authority visibly cracking. Amara felt the weight of every eye in the cabin fixed on her, but she held her ground, refusing to shrink beneath his hostile stare. She would not retreat. Not here. Not now. A tense silence settled over the first-class cabin, broken only by the low hum of the plane's ventilation. The captain's voice, tight with frustration, finally cut through. "I'm giving you one last chance, Major." He spat her title as though it were a curse. "Move to the back of the plane." Amara's gaze remained steady. "I paid for this seat, Captain. This is my assigned place. I won't be moving." For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "This isn't about your seat, Major. It's about respect for our first-class passengers. And if you don't comply, I will have you removed." A ripple of murmurs spread across the rows behind her. She heard the whispers, felt the eyes of fellow passengers boring into her back. Some were filled with empathy, others with curiosity, and a few with outright discomfort. But no one looked away. They all seemed to sense that something significant was unfolding before them. Just as Amara was about to respond, the same middle-aged woman from before, seated directly behind her, spoke up again, louder this time. "This is disgraceful," she said, her voice trembling with outrage. "She's served our country. How can you stand there and deny her a seat she's rightfully earned?" More voices joined in, a murmur of agreement and indignation spreading through the cabin like wildfire. A man in business attire turned to the captain, his face drawn tight with disapproval. "What kind of example are you setting? She's clearly earned her place here." The captain's face flushed, his confidence visibly faltering as he glanced around the cabin. It was clear he hadn't anticipated this level of resistance from the passengers, hadn't expected them to rally around her, a stranger in uniform, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "If anyone continues to interfere," he snapped, his voice laced with barely concealed fury, "I'll have security escort you all off this flight." Amara felt the humiliation rising like a bitter wave, but beneath it was a fiercer emotion. Anger, the kind that sharpened her resolve and fueled her courage. She looked him squarely in the eye, letting her gaze speak the words she didn't need to say. Her silence became its own form of defiance, her dignity an unspoken challenge he couldn't ignore. At that moment, a figure emerged from the galley, her crisp uniform and composed expression immediately calming the tension. The head flight attendant, a tall, poised woman with a professional but determined look, stepped forward, her eyes moving from the captain to Amara, assessing the situation in a heartbeat. Her gaze softened as it landed on Amara's uniform, and understanding dawned in her expression. "Captain," the flight attendant began, her voice calm yet authoritative. "Is there an issue here?" The captain's frustration flared anew. "This passenger is refusing to move to economy," he said through gritted teeth, his tone as dismissive as ever. "She's disrupting the flight." The flight attendant's gaze shifted to Amara, her eyes respectful, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, are you in the correct seat?" Amara nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, I am." The flight attendant took a deep breath, and with a look that spoke volumes, she turned to the captain. "Sir," she said, her tone firm, "Major Johnson is a United States Army officer, and she is seated in her assigned seat. We will not be moving her." A stunned silence followed. The captain opened his mouth, as if to argue, but the authority in the flight attendant's tone silenced him. She stood her ground, meeting his glare without a hint of fear. For a brief moment, he looked as though he might push back. But then he saw the expressions of the passengers around them, impatient, angry, and fully supportive of the woman standing before them in uniform. Without another word, the captain turned on his heel, his face a mask of barely contained rage, and stormed back toward the cockpit. A collective sigh of relief washed over the cabin, the passengers visibly relaxing as the tension dissipated. Amara's heart still pounded, her body humming with adrenaline, but she forced herself to breathe, to hold her head high. She had won, but the victory was bittersweet, tainted by the public display of prejudice she'd been forced to endure. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their glances now filled with respect and admiration rather than curiosity. A small smile crept onto her face as she met the gaze of the head flight attendant. "Thank you," Amara whispered, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. The flight attendant nodded, her own expression warm. "Thank you, Major," she replied, giving her a look that conveyed solidarity, as if to say, "You are not alone." Amara settled back into her seat, her heart finally beginning to calm, her dignity intact. She hadn't just claimed her seat, she'd made a stand, one that would resonate far beyond the confines of this airplane. And as the plane taxied down the runway, lifting into the sky, she knew this was a battle she would carry forward, not just for herself, but for all those who'd ever been told they didn't belong. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm, but Amara could still feel the lingering tension. Like a wound barely beginning to heal, she stared out the window, the clouds drifting by as she tried to process the public humiliation she just endured. Her mind reeled, a whirl of anger and exhaustion churning inside her, threatening to break the calm she struggled to maintain. Then, she felt a light tap on her shoulder. Turning, she saw the middle-aged woman from the row behind her, the same woman who had spoken up during the confrontation. Her face was warm, ice-kind but fierce, with a look of quiet determination that made Amara's anger soften. "I just wanted to say..." The woman's voice was gentle but resolute, her words carrying a weight that felt like solidarity. "Thank you. What you did back there, standing your ground, that took courage. You didn't deserve any of that. And I'm so sorry you had to go through it." Amara nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She hadn't expected anyone to care, let alone speak up. But here this woman was, a stranger, yet somehow a friend in the simplest, most profound way. Across the aisle, a man in business attire leaned over, his expression apologetic. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," he said, shaking his head. "What that captain did was just wrong. He had no right to treat you like that. Not after all you've done for this country." Amara felt a blush creep up her cheeks, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She wasn't accustomed to such open support, especially from people she didn't know. But here they were, each word feeling like a balm, easing the sting of the captain's words and actions. Others around her began nodding, murmuring their agreement. A young woman a few seats down, who looked barely out of college, raised her voice so the whole cabin could hear. "It's about time someone called out this kind of treatment. I'm so tired of seeing people like you, people who serve us, treated like you don't belong. You're an inspiration." Amara's chest tightened, her pulse quickening as she took in their words. For the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself to breathe fully, letting their support sink in. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was something bigger, something that resonated with everyone around her. The flight attendant reappeared, her expression softer than before. She knelt beside Amara's seat, meeting her gaze with an understanding that required no words. "Major Johnson," she said quietly, "I want to apologize on behalf of the airline. What happened was unacceptable. And please know that I will be filing a report. You deserve so much better than what you experienced today." Amara's throat tightened. She managed a small smile, nodding at the flight attendant. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and relief. The flight attendant placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure he's held accountable. Ma'am, that kind of behavior has no place here or anywhere." She glanced back toward the cockpit, a flicker of resolve in her eyes. "We're not letting this go." The woman behind her chimed in, her tone resolute. "You let us know if you need anything, legal help, witnesses, whatever it is. You're not alone in this, Major." Amara looked around at the faces surrounding her, ordinary people from all walks of life, standing with her, a stranger who had simply wanted a peaceful journey home. The magnitude of their support filled her with an unexpected warmth, a sense of belonging that went far beyond a seat assignment. In that moment, they weren't just passengers. They were allies, part of a community that refused to let prejudice and injustice stand unchallenged. The captain's words had sought to make her feel small, unworthy, like she didn't belong. But the voices around her, the kindness in their eyes, reminded her of her own worth, her place, and the respect she deserved. They were telling her, in the simplest way, that she mattered, and that they would fight alongside her if needed. As she sat back, allowing herself a moment to relax, Amara knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't just going to let this slide, wasn't going to let the captain's actions disappear into the silence. She had a platform, a voice, and the strength to stand up for herself and others who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. A determination sparked within her, fierce and unyielding. She would see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. For the first time since boarding, Amara smiled, a smile not of relief, but of resolve. She was no longer just a passenger on this flight. She was a symbol of defiance, a voice for change. And as the plane continued its journey across the sky, she knew her fight was far from over. The flight settled into a strained quiet, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the echoes of earlier tension still thick in the air. Amara tried to focus on the clouds drifting past her window, a serene landscape that contrasted sharply with the storm raging within her. She couldn't help replaying the captain's words, the sharp sting of his dismissal, the way he'd looked at her like she was an intruder. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to let go of the anger that simmered beneath the surface. But the hurt ran deeper than one encounter. It was a wound that had been opened by years of subtle and overt prejudice, by moments where she had been reminded, again and again, that for some people, her uniform wasn't a shield from bias. It was a target for it. Beside her, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up earlier leaned over, her voice soft. "You know," she said gently, "I've traveled a lot in my life, seen all kinds of things, but I've never seen something quite like that. You're strong to have handled it the way you did." Amara forced a small smile, the kind that masked her exhaustion. "It's something you get used to after a while," she replied quietly, though the truth of her words left a bitter taste in her mouth. She hated that she had grown accustomed to enduring these kinds of encounters, hated that resilience had become her default response to prejudice. "You shouldn't have to be," the woman said firmly, as if reading her thoughts. "No one should." Her words settled around Amara like a comforting blanket, a reminder that there were people in this world who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. A few seats away, another passenger, a young man in jeans and a hoodie, caught her eye and gave her a respectful nod. The quiet, unspoken gestures from the people around her began to feel like a steady heartbeat, grounding her, assuring her that she wasn't alone in this moment. She felt a surge of strength return, fueled by the silent support surrounding her. Just then, the flight attendant returned, a look of cautious resolve on her face. She leaned down, speaking just above a whisper. Major Johnson, I wanted to let you know that we've made a formal report of the incident. The airline's management is already aware, and they're planning to address it once we land. Amara looked up, meeting the attendant's eyes with a quiet gratitude. Thank you. I appreciate you standing up for me. The flight attendant's eyes softened. You stood up for yourself first. Ma'am, we just followed your lead. With a reassuring smile, she added, justice may be slow, but it's coming. Amara nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and determination. She could sense the wheels beginning to turn, the small but significant ripple her actions had set in motion. The realization brought a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of the strength she carried not only as a soldier but as a person who would not be silenced. As the plane flew through the sky, the cabin lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the passengers. Many began to close their eyes, settling in for the remainder of the flight. But Amara's mind was wide awake, racing with thoughts about what would come next. She had learned long ago that silence could be as powerful as any weapon. Sometimes, it was in the stillness, in the calm after the storm, that change truly began. Her phone buzzed with a message, and she glanced down to see a text from her mother. Can't wait to see you, honey. We're so proud of you. The words filled her with warmth, grounding her in the love and support waiting for her on the other side of this flight. She took a deep breath, letting the feeling wash over her, anchoring her to her purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her family, for every soldier who would come after her, and for all those who had been silenced by prejudice. The captain might have tried to make her feel small, to strip away her dignity with a single glance, a single condescending word, but he had failed. If anything, his actions had reignited the fire within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She would ensure that her story became a rallying cry, a call for others to stand up, to challenge the quiet injustices that too often went ignored. The plane hummed around her, a steady, calming rhythm. Amara leaned back in her seat, finally allowing her eyes to close. But this wasn't surrender. It was a gathering of strength, a quiet preparation for the battle ahead. Because when they landed, she knew her journey was far from finished. In fact, it was only just beginning. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the rumble of the wheels on the runway breaking the quiet stillness that had settled over the cabin. As passengers stretched and reached for their bags, Amara felt a mixture of relief and anticipation tighten in her chest. She'd made it through the flight, but she knew that her battle was far from over. Her story was only just beginning, and the accountability she demanded was waiting on the other side of those plane doors. As the plane rolled to a stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Amara gathered her belongings, her movements calm but deliberate. She could feel the curious glances from other passengers, a few nodding to her as if to say, "We're with you." She appreciated the quiet support, but she also felt a simmering determination, a resolve that went beyond gratitude. She hadn't fought just to walk away in silence. The flight attendant who had stood by her earlier met her eyes, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "Major Johnson," she said gently, "there will be someone from management waiting at the gate. They've been informed of everything." Amara nodded, a weight lifting off her shoulders as she returned the smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I won't let this get brushed aside." As she made her way down the aisle, passengers moved aside respectfully, a few offering words of encouragement. "You did the right thing," a woman murmured, her face filled with empathy. Another man gave her a firm nod, saying, "Thank you for standing up. We need more people like you." Amara felt their support like a steadying hand on her back, bolstering her as she stepped into the jet bridge. Her heart pounded with each step, but it was a rhythm she welcomed, a reminder of the purpose driving her forward. Just beyond the jet bridge stood two representatives from the airline, their expressions tense and uncomfortable as they spotted her approaching. The first, a woman with a polished appearance and a stiff smile, extended a hand. "Major Johnson, I'm Claire Thompson, Head of Customer Relations. We'd like to sincerely apologize for your experience on this flight. I assure you, we're taking this very seriously." Amara accepted the handshake, her gaze steady as she replied, "Thank you for addressing it, Ms. Thompson, but I need to know that this won't just end with an apology. What happened was more than an isolated incident." The second representative, a man with a clipboard and a strained expression, nodded, "We understand, Major. The captain's behavior was completely unacceptable, and he has been temporarily suspended pending an investigation. We'll be reviewing all details of the incident." Amara raised an eyebrow, her tone firm but professional. "And what will that investigation entail? An apology isn't enough. I want to ensure that measures are put in place so that no one else has to go through what I did today." Claire's posture softened, her voice lowering. "We're implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training across our staff, and we're working on updating our policies to address situations like these. We know it's overdue, but we're committed to change." It was a start, but Amara wasn't satisfied. "It's not just about training. It's about creating a culture of accountability. That captain thought he could treat me like I didn't belong. No amount of training will change that if your organization doesn't hold people accountable." Claire nodded, her gaze earnest. "I understand, Major. We're committed to ensuring real change, and we'd be grateful if you'd stay involved. Help us shape the policies moving forward." The offer caught Amara by surprise, but only for a moment. She felt a surge of purpose. This was an opportunity to make a difference, to use her voice and experience to bring about meaningful reform. She had faced discrimination not only on this flight but countless times throughout her life. And now, here was a chance to do something about it. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. "I'll be in touch." With that, she walked away from the gate, her heart thumping with a sense of triumph tempered by resolve. The journey had been painful, the battle exhausting, but she knew she had cracked something open. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a call to arms for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had been made to feel lesser because of who they were. As she moved through the terminal, passengers who had been on her flight crossed her path, offering waves, nods, and quiet smiles of encouragement. She felt their support like a wave at her back, a reminder that she was never truly alone. Outside, her family was waiting, her mother, arms outstretched, eyes glistening with pride, her younger brother, grinning from ear to ear, her nephew, who raced forward, grabbing her hand. They were her grounding force, the reason she fought so hard. She hugged them all tightly, feeling the warmth of home wash over her, filling the cracks left by the day's events. But as she looked back at the terminal, she knew that her fight wasn't over. There were others still waiting for change, still hoping that one day, they too would be seen, respected, and treated with dignity. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. She would make sure her voice echoed beyond the walls of this terminal, beyond the headlines, and into the hearts of those who needed it most. And as she held her nephew's hand, her resolve solidified, stronger than ever. She would keep fighting, keep speaking, and keep pushing for change. For herself, for her family, and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. By the time Amara reached home, she was exhausted, yet sleep felt impossible. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly since she'd left the airport. Messages pouring in from friends, fellow soldiers, even people she hadn't heard from in years. But what caught her off guard was how her story had spread like wildfire across social media. A passenger on the plane had recorded the encounter, capturing the captain's condescension, the tense standoff, and the powerful moment Amara had refused to back down. The video had already gained thousands of views, and it was still climbing. She sank onto her couch, scrolling through the outpouring of support online. Each post, each comment, seemed to carry the same refrain: "This has to stop." Strangers from all walks of life shared their own experiences with discrimination and prejudice, stories that mirrored hers in haunting ways. Amara felt a surge of anger and empathy with each story she read, knowing she was far from alone in her fight. Her moment of defiance had sparked something larger, a collective anger, a call for change. As the hours slipped by, Amara's phone lit up with a message from her commanding officer, Colonel Michaels, a figure known for his quiet strength and unwavering support of his soldiers. His message was brief, but it carried a weight that made her sit up straighter. "Proud of you, Major. Keep pushing forward. Your voice matters." Amara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the validation settle over her like a steadying hand. It wasn't just the support of strangers that mattered. It was knowing that the people who'd seen her dedication, her loyalty, were standing behind her. The next morning, Amara's story had made national headlines. News anchors recounted the details of her encounter, the video playing across screens in homes, airports, and cafes all over the country. Phrases like racial profiling, abuse of power, and accountability flashed across the screens. Anchors calling her courage a powerful reminder of resilience. She watched in disbelief, realizing her story had taken on a life of its own. Later that day, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something told her to answer. Major Johnson? The voice on the other end was calm, but she could detect a hint of urgency. This is Sarah Lynn, a reporter with the National Tribune. I'd like to interview you about your experience. If you're willing to share your story in your own words. Amara hesitated, her mind racing. She'd never been one for the spotlight. Her life had always been about service, duty, and the quiet pride of her accomplishments. But this was different. Her story had already become a rallying cry for others, and she knew this was an opportunity to amplify that voice, to address not just her own encounter but the wider issue of racial bias in public spaces. Ms. Lynn, she replied, her voice steady. I'd be honored. Later that afternoon, the reporter arrived at Amara's house. Sarah was professional yet compassionate. Her eyes filled with understanding as she set up her recording equipment. As they settled into the interview, Amara found herself opening up, sharing not just the details of that day but the years of discrimination she had faced, both subtle and overt. Throughout her life and career, she spoke about her pride in serving her country and the bitter irony of being questioned about her place in a first-class seat she had rightfully earned. It wasn't just about that seat, Amara said, her voice resonating with conviction. It was about every time I've been made to feel like I don't belong. And it's not just me. This is something so many people face. People who've worked just as hard, who've earned their place, yet are constantly challenged and questioned because of who they are. That's what has to change. Sarah listened intently, her pen racing across the notepad. Major Johnson, she said softly, I think you've just given a voice to thousands of people who have felt silenced. Thank you for sharing this. The article was published the next day. The headline bold and powerful. Major Amara Johnson stands her ground. A fight for respect and equality. The story resonated deeply, striking a chord with readers nationwide. Comments flooded in from readers sharing their own experiences, their admiration, and their support. Amara's story became more than just an isolated incident. It became a symbol of the broader struggle against racial discrimination in everyday life. Social media exploded with calls for change. People tagging airlines, demanding stronger policies, more accountability, and real consequences for those who abused their authority. The airline itself issued a public statement, promising a thorough investigation and policy reforms. Though Amara knew this was just the beginning, she was receiving invitations to speak at conferences, to participate in panels on racial bias and accountability. Her inbox was filled with messages from advocates, soldiers, teachers, and students, all of them inspired, all of them determined to make a difference. And then, an email caught her eye. It was from a young woman named Tanya who had recently completed her own Army training. Dear Major Johnson, it began. I watched your video, and it made me believe that I could keep going. Thank you for showing me that we belong, even when people try to tell us otherwise. Amara felt a wave of pride and determination swell within her as she read Tanya's words. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was their fight. A fight to dismantle the prejudice woven into the fabric of society. To make sure that every soldier, every person, could walk with their head held high, without fearing judgment based on the color of their skin. She closed her laptop, her resolve solidified. She was ready to keep pushing, to make sure this movement didn't lose momentum. This was her moment to turn pain into purpose, to challenge a system that had stood unchallenged for too long. Amara knew that the journey ahead would be long and grueling, but as she stood at the heart of a growing movement, her voice a beacon for others, she felt a power unlike anything she had felt before. She was not just Major Amara Johnson anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of the relentless pursuit of justice. And with every passing day, her voice only grew louder, echoing the cries of countless others who had waited too long for someone to stand up and say, enough. The days following the interview were a whirlwind. Amara's story continued to spread, not just across the country but around the world. News channels replayed her interview, her face a steady, unwavering image as she called for change. her words a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. The momentum was undeniable, and with each passing day, it felt less like a story about one person's experience and more like a movement. One evening, as Amara sat down to sift through the hundreds of emails that had flooded her inbox, a message caught her eye. It was from the United Association for Racial Equity, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting systemic discrimination. They were organizing a national conference focused on ending racial profiling in public spaces, and they wanted her to be the keynote speaker. Her story, they said, had become a symbol of resilience and a powerful call to action. Amara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the invitation. Speaking out on her own was one thing, but taking the stage at a national conference, representing countless voices who had experienced the same kind of prejudice, was another. She knew she couldn't turn it down. This was her chance to advocate for lasting change, for policies that would go beyond hollow apologies and start dismantling the structures that allowed discrimination to flourish. On the day of the conference, Amara arrived at the convention center and was greeted by Sarah Lynn, the reporter who had first shared her story with the world. "You've inspired a lot of people, Major," Sarah said with a warm smile. "I think today is going to be a powerful moment." Amara nodded, feeling a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She'd faced far more dangerous situations in her career, yet the thought of standing before an audience of strangers, bearing her vulnerability, made her pulse race. But as she scanned the room, her gaze landed on the faces of young men and women, soldiers, students, mothers, and fathers, each of them looking at her with quiet hope, as if they were counting on her to say what they hadn't been able to. She stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and took a deep breath, steadying herself before beginning. "Thank you all for being here today," she started, her voice clear and strong. "I stand here not just as Major Amara Johnson, a soldier who has served her country, but as a person who, like so many others, has had to face the painful reality of prejudice in a space that should have felt like home." She saw heads nodding in the audience, eyes fixed on her, some glistening with emotion, others hardened with resolve. "What happened to me on that plane was just one incident, but it's part of a much larger issue. Racial profiling and discrimination are embedded in the structures of our society, so deeply that they've become almost invisible, until moments like these bring them to the surface. This isn't just about one airline or one captain. It's about a culture that tolerates prejudice, that allows people in positions of authority to abuse their power without consequence." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "But we don't need more apologies," she continued, her voice growing firmer. "We need action. We need policies that hold people accountable. We need to make sure that discrimination has no place in our public spaces, in our airlines, in our police forces, or in any institution that claims to serve the public." A wave of applause rippled through the audience. But Amara wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her tone shifting from firm to compassionate. "I know that change is hard. It's uncomfortable, and it requires that we look at parts of ourselves and our society that we may not want to see. But discomfort is a small price to pay for equality and justice. If we're serious about dismantling prejudice, then we have to be willing to examine the systems that allow it to persist." The applause grew louder, people rising to their feet, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. But Amara stayed focused, knowing the hardest part was yet to come. When we demand accountability, we're not just asking for apologies and suspensions. We're asking for reform. We're asking that companies, institutions, and leaders create spaces where everyone, regardless of their race or background, is treated with dignity and respect. And that won't happen until we hold individuals responsible for their actions and create real consequences for prejudice. The crowd was on their feet now, their clapping echoing through the hall, a thunderous sound that filled the room and spilled into the spaces beyond. But Amara's message wasn't just meant for those in the audience. She hoped it would reach boardrooms, training rooms, classrooms, and family rooms everywhere conversations on prejudice and equality were needed. After the speech, she was approached by dozens of people, fellow veterans, students, activists, and even corporate leaders who wanted to bring her message back to their own organizations. She was humbled by the outpouring of support but also energized. The promise of change was no longer just a distant hope, it was within reach. As she left the convention center that evening, Her phone buzzed with a new message from a high-ranking executive at the airline. They were inviting her to join an advisory council focused on implementing anti-bias policies, a move they hoped would send a strong message to their employees and customers alike. Amara's heart swelled with determination as she replied to the message. She accepted the invitation. Knowing that this was only the beginning of her journey, she was ready to continue the fight, to make sure that her voice, and the voices of those who stood with her, would be heard. As she walked out into the evening, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her story was no longer just her own. It was a movement, call to action, a beacon for change. And as long as she had the strength to speak, she would keep fighting for a world where everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, could finally feel like they belonged. In the weeks that followed her speech at the conference, Amara's life transformed in ways she hadn't expected. What had started as a painful encounter on a plane had turned into a full-blown movement. Her inbox overflowed with messages from people across the country, each email carrying stories of resilience, tales of discrimination, and pleas for change. Some were from young people just entering the workforce, others from veterans like herself, and even a few from airline employees who had witnessed similar injustices and wanted to join her mission. The airline moved swiftly, putting together a council of advisors, including Amara, to develop new anti-bias policies and training programs for all employees. Their efforts drew national attention, with other companies and industries beginning to take note, announcing their own initiatives to address discrimination and accountability within their organizations. The movement was growing, its reach spreading beyond airports to schools, hospitals, and public offices. Amara found herself invited to speak at panels, join webinars, and consult with major corporations that wanted her insight on implementing real, lasting change. She was wary at first, careful to avoid becoming just another corporate symbol or a face of diversity. But each time she stepped onto a stage or sat down in a meeting, she reminded herself why she was there. Not for publicity or fame, but to dismantle the silent barriers that had kept so many others from having a voice. One day, she received an invitation that felt different. It was from a national coalition focused on policy reform, and they wanted her to testify before Congress on the issue of racial profiling in public and private spaces. The email was brief, but the weight of it pressed heavily on her. She knew the significance of the opportunity. This was her chance to influence real, systemic change. She called her mother that night, her voice thick with emotion. "They want me to speak to Congress. Mama, they want me to tell them what needs to change." Her mother's voice was filled with pride. "Amara, you've already inspired so many. Now, you have a chance to make sure no one else has to go through what you did. Speak your truth, baby. Make them listen." When the day finally arrived, Amara sat in a packed congressional hearing room, facing rows of officials, lawmakers, and activists. The air was tense, every person aware that this was more than a routine meeting. This was a call to address the deep-seated biases that had long gone unchallenged in spaces where they should never have existed. As she adjusted the microphone and began to speak, her voice steady yet filled with urgency, she felt the power of every person who had shared their story with her. "I am not here to recount my experience for sympathy," she began. "I am here because what happened to me represents a pattern of discrimination that has hurt, marginalized, and silenced people of color for generations." Her words echoed through the room, each one weighted with the voices of those she carried with her. She outlined the need for concrete policies, calling for accountability measures that went beyond training videos and one-time apologies. She spoke of her vision for a world where public spaces, airplanes, workplaces, and all institutions could be places of safety and equality, free from the biases that had too often gone unaddressed. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Lawmakers and activists approached her afterward, shaking her hand, offering words of support, and promising to fight for the changes she had called for. Amara felt a rush of relief, knowing that her words had made an impact, but she also felt a fierce sense of duty. This was only a beginning, a first step in a long journey toward real, lasting reform. Back home, the movement continued to flourish. News channels reported on her testimony, sparking discussions across the nation. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting her message, and people everywhere began sharing their own stories of discrimination. A groundswell of change was building, fueled by everyday people who had found strength in her story. One evening, as Amara reviewed her packed schedule, meetings, panels, interviews, she received an unexpected video call. It was from Tanya, the young Army trainee who had emailed her weeks before. The girl's face lit up on the screen, her expression a mix of awe and gratitude. "Major Johnson," Tanya began, her voice trembling with excitement. "I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I feel like I belong, like I have a place in this world, no matter what anyone else says." Amara felt her heart swell, her voice catching as she replied, "Tanya, you've always belonged. You don't need anyone else's permission to take up space in this world. You're powerful just as you are." They talked for a while, Tanya sharing her dreams and struggles, and Amara offering encouragement, reminding her of her own strength and potential. When they finally said goodbye, Amara realized just how far her influence had spread, not just in the corporate world, but in the hearts of young people like Tanya who were finding their voices, determined to make the world a better place. As she looked out her window at the city lights below, Amara felt a deep sense of purpose settle within her. This journey had started with pain, but it had grown into something powerful and transformative, something that went beyond herself. She was part of a movement, collective voice calling for dignity, respect, and equality for all. The work was far from over, but she felt ready for the challenges that lay ahead. She had found her place not only as a soldier but as a beacon for change, a voice that would continue to speak up. Even when the road was uncertain, the world was listening now. And as long as there were people like Tanya waiting for a world where they didn't have to fight for their place, Amara would keep pushing forward. This was her mission, her calling, and she knew that, together, they could create the change they all deserved. As Amara looked out at the crowd gathered in the sunlit auditorium, she felt a surge of pride mixed with quiet humility. It had been over a year since her encounter on that flight, and now, standing at the podium, she could see the impact of her journey reflected back at her. The faces before her were filled with hope and determination. Students, activists, community leaders, veterans, and everyday people who had joined the movement for equality and accountability. They were here not only because of her story but because they had made it their own. "Thank you for being here today," she began, her voice steady, carrying a depth of gratitude that had only grown over time. "This journey has taught me that true change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we decide, collectively, to speak up, to share our stories, and to hold each other accountable for building a better, fairer world." Applause rippled through the room, people nodding, their eyes locked on her. She had spoken at countless events over the past year, each speech bringing new momentum to the movement, each connection strengthening the sense of unity. But today was different. Today felt like a culmination, a celebration of progress and a promise to continue pushing forward. Amara glanced at the banners behind her, displaying the symbols of the organizations that had partnered with her to turn her vision into reality. Training programs for airline staff, anti-bias legislation in several states, mentorship initiatives for young people of color. These weren't just policies, they were the embodiment of everything she and the movement had fought for. "We've made progress," she continued, "but there is still so much work to do. Change is a living, breathing thing. It requires constant nurturing, and it needs people like you, people who refuse to stay silent, who believe in the dignity of every human being." As she spoke, she thought about the messages she'd received from countless people whose lives had been touched by her story. Veterans who felt seen for the first time, teenagers who felt empowered to stand up for themselves, employees who now worked in environments transformed by new policies. And then, there were the messages from individuals who had once been like the captain on her flight, people who admitted their own biases, people who had taken steps to confront the prejudice within themselves. Amara had never expected that her story would reach them, but somehow, it had. When she finished her speech, the audience rose to their feet, filling the room with a standing ovation that echoed off the walls. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her, feeling the immense power of their collective strength. This was no longer her story, it was a shared journey, one she had only helped to start. After the event, people lined up to speak with her, each handshake, each smile a reminder of the community she had found along the way. Some shared personal stories of resilience and transformation. Others thanked her for the courage she had shown. But each interaction left her feeling both grateful and profoundly aware of the responsibility she carried. A young woman approached, her expression nervous but determined. "Major Johnson," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I wanted to thank you. Because of you, I decided to start my own organization to fight for equal treatment in schools. I used to think my voice didn't matter, but you showed me that it does." Amara's eyes softened as she took the woman's hand. "Your voice matters more than you know. Keep pushing forward. You're making a difference." The woman's face lit up, her confidence growing with Amara's encouragement. Watching her walk away, Amara felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had fought for change not for recognition, but for moments like these, where one person's courage could inspire another's, like a ripple expanding outward. Later that night, as she sat alone in her quiet living room, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought back to that day on the plane, the sharp sting of the captain's words, the humiliation, the anger. She had felt so isolated in that moment, so alone in the face of his prejudice. But now, looking back, she saw that it had been the beginning of something greater than she could have ever imagined. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. This journey had taught her so much, not just about the world, but about herself. She had learned the power of resilience, the strength in vulnerability, and the profound impact of a single voice. Her story had become a legacy, a beacon of hope for others, and a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of deeply rooted prejudice. Her phone buzzed, a message from Tanya, the young Army trainee who had once reached out to her. "Major, I wanted you to know that I made it through training. Your strength inspired me every step of the way. Thank you for showing me what's possible." Amara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Tanya, and so many others like her, were the future leaders, advocates, voices of change. They were proof that the movement was alive, growing, and stronger than ever. As she set her phone down, Amara allowed herself a moment to rest, knowing that tomorrow, she would continue the work. The journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her purpose, and as long as there were people waiting for justice, she would keep fighting. This was her legacy, a testament to resilience, courage, and the unwavering belief in a world where everyone belonged. And she knew, deep in her heart, that they were closer to that world now than they had ever been before.